Chapter 5, Behavioral and Social Learning Theories. The organizing questions for this chapter are, what is learning? What are behavioral learning theories? And what are some of the principles of behavioral learning theories? And how has social learning theory contributed to our understanding of human learning? The next couple chapters is all about learning, different theories of learning. This one's on behaviorism. So we ask ourselves, what is learning? Children are excellent learners. Actually, humans are excellent learners. Dogs are good learners too, but humans are really good learners. What they can learn, however, may not always be what we intend to teach. Learning is usually defined as a change in an individual caused by an experience. Piaget talked about assimilation and accommodation. That was the experience. The experience, assimilate. A new experience comes along, and you have to accommodate that new information. So learning was actually defined by a change in the individual caused by experience. Behavioral learning theory really took place, probably started in the 30s and 40s, really took hold in the 50s. Focuses on ways that pleasurable or unpleasant consequences of behavior change individuals' learning behavior over time. And then the other one we're going to look at is social learning theories, which focuses on the effect of thought on action and an action on thought. I'm going to show you a little video clip here. This is a video clip of Watson, who is considered to be the father of behavioral learning theories.
But not everyone believes that biology is destiny. For many scientists, it's your experiences in life that count. Your upbringing, your education, your environment. Chief among these scientists is psychologist John Watson, who offers a theory that is the mirror opposite of eugenics.
This was the heyday of hereditarians and geneticists who said that human beings were constrained by their genetic inheritance. And Watson was saying that this is baloney, that human beings were shaped solely by their environment.
So Watson was a nurturer.
For years, Watson studies the behavior of babies, hundreds of them. To Watson, we arrive in the world a blank slate, tabula rasa. Nearly everything is learned. Even things we think are instinctual, like fear. To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little
Before we
Albert.
had ethics in psychology.
He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then, Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited. Watson calls his theory behaviorism and begins to popularize it. He urges parents to take active control of their children's upbringing by shaping their environment. To think of the home as a scientific laboratory.
So Watson was the first one that came up with that idea that behaviorists said that learning, it was defined by their environment. So behaviorists really look at the interaction between the individual and the environment, whether it's pleasurable or unpleasurable, and they believe that that's what affects learning over time. So when we look at behavioral learning theories, there's some pretty much standard words that go along with it. The idea of classical conditioning, which Ivan Pavlov contributed to the theorist, And then we have operant conditioning, which B.F. Skinner pretty much brought along. So Skinner and Pavlov were probably two of the big names, and Watson were the big names in behavioral learning theory. So Pavlov did this idea in which a neutral stimulus, which is what actually Watson had brought about, was when he introduced the clanging with the rat. And like I said, that was way before we had ethics in psychology, because it really wasn't good to take those little adopted babies and do that to them. And I guess Watson died pretty young, actually, because, Albert, the little baby, died pretty young. And come to find out, he was actually afraid of almost anything furry. And then Skinner did a little bit more with pigeons and some rat tests, too. So we'll look a little bit more about what they ended up doing. So Pavlov and his colleagues, while studying the digestive system, he wasn't actually even a behavioral psychologist. At the time, he was a gastroenterologist. He was a doctor who was looking at how we process food. He was looking at the digestive system of dogs. Noticed that changes in timing and rate of salivation of these animals. So he started noticing that when he presented the dog with food, that the saliva would automatically occur. So we have an unconditioned stimulus, which provoked the response without any prior training. So this idea, if we look at the dog, is meat. And then we had the unconditioned response, which is behavioral, you can't help it, would be salivation. Much like if a puff of air comes towards your eye, your unconditioned response is automatically for you to blink. The neutral stimulus, which should have no effect on the response in question, so in this case he used a bell, should have no response. The dog should not salivate based on the sound of a bell. And then we have a conditioned response, which if you pair the bell with every time the meat shows up or the food shows up, the dog will begin to salivate at the sound of the bell. In your book, there's a figure on it. I don't know exactly what the number is. Let me look. It is figure 5.1. It shows that the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, the unconditioned response is salivation. And then you pair it with a neutral stimulus, which is the bell. And normally in the beginning, you'll get no response. But if you continue to do it, ring the bell every time you pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, pretty soon after it's conditioned, ringing the bell will cause the dog to salivate. Skinner was a little bit different than Pavlov. Skinner proposed that reflex behaviors account for only a small proportion of all actions. So things that you do just naturally by reflex are very limited. And he proposed another class of behaviorism, which he called operant behaviors. Skinner's work focused on the relationship between the behavior and its consequences. So he said, it depended on whether you use pleasant or unpleasant consequences to change a behavior, and that is referred to as operant conditioning. He's really famous for the development and use of his Skinner box, and he had a very simple apparatus in which he studied usually animals or rats or pigeons, and he taught them to do different things based on whether they got a pleasant or an unpleasant response. And he didn't really hurt them. I'm going to show a little bitty on this one. I'm going to try and make this a little bit bigger. Don't think I can, though. It'll get too big.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately.
It pecks.
He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward.
So you can't do that to humans.
The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement?
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot on the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices, and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice of whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act of will, and eventually I think you need to attribute nothing to it.
And that's probably where people have parted from Skinner a lot lately, the whole idea of free will. He was definitely an environment shaped. He thought that everything had to do, operant conditioning, everything had to do with its schedule of reinforcement or your positive or negative consequences. We've actually found so many new things out, like why people crave sugar and why people sometimes tend to have alcoholism or schizophrenia or other such type diseases, and it has to do more with genes. They've even found microbes now in your gut, that little tiny microbes. They call them zombie bugs that actually will hitchhike onto like a rat's. It's one of this little microbe that rats get, and it actually makes the rat less inhibited, and the rat will go out to where in front of cats so that cats can eat it. And it's actually a parasite that lives inside the cat, and the only way it can live is to after it is excrement, after it's excreted, then the mice eat the cat excrement, and then the mice get it, and then they become bold again, and then they get eaten by a cat, and that's the only way the microbe survives, is by this cycle of being pooped out and then eaten by the mice and then eaten by a cat again. So we know that some behaviors are actually these little microbes. There's new research that shows that there are microbes inside your stomach that tells you whether you want to eat sugary things or not sugary things and stuff like that. So free will, maybe we really don't have free will in the sense that microbes are controlling us as well. But there are some people that gamble and other people that could walk into a casino and not put one dime in. And then there's other people that will stay there and spend every last cent. So there's a little bit more to it than Skinner thought. But during that time that when behaviorism was in its heyday, that's pretty much what they talked about, was this idea of schedules of reinforcement. So other principles that go along with behaviorism that are pretty much common across, whether it is the Premack principle or whether it is operant conditioning or whether it's classical conditioning, behavioral learning theories have shown that the language to describe the consequences of behavior shape later behavior. We have reinforcers. increase the frequency of behavior, and punishers decrease the frequency. So if it's a reinforcer, if it has a word reinforcer in it, it's going to increase the frequency of a behavior. If it's a punisher, it's going to decrease the frequency of a behavior. And reinforcement can be a primary, secondary, and it can also be positive or negative. Punishment, on the other hand, involves weakening a behavior by either introducing adverse consequences or by removing reinforcers, removing something pleasurable. So the Premack principle, though, I call it Grandma's rule. It states that ways to increase less enjoyed activities is linked to more enjoyed activities. So this would be something like, you can't eat your dessert until you finish your vegetables. So the less enjoyed activity is linked with the more enjoyed activity. And so therefore, the likelihood that you'll do the less liked activity is higher because it's linked with the reward. So reinforcement examples. Primary reinforcers are such things as food, water, warmth, security, and sex. One of the reasons why porn is the #1 seller on the internet is because it's a primary reinforcer. So is food. That's why a lot of people do a lot of things for food. But so is security, like being secure, and water and warmth. But those are the primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers try to get us primary reinforcers. So money. Money can buy food. Money can buy sex. Money can buy warmth and security. Money can buy water. But grades are also a secondary reinforcer because we have linked grades with the idea that the better grades you get, the better job you're going to get and the better you're going to do, which then in turn will get you more money, which then in turn will get you more food, which then in turn will get you a safe and secure environment. Things when little kids are little, like stars, a star chart and stuff, that links us to usually a primary reinforcer where you'll get something like a food choice, or you might get some kind of a treat or something like that. But grades and stars also get us love, right? And they give us affection and somebody that is doting on us. Which is another one, which is praise. Praise gives us that idea of love and warmth and stuff that goes along with that. Now, this is the one you guys always get wrong on the test, so pay attention to this one. Positive versus negative reinforcers. Notice the word reinforcer is in there. Both of them will strengthen a behavior. Both positive and negative reinforcers strengthen a behavior. The difference is a positive reinforcer, a pleasurable consequence is presented. So you will get something for a positive reinforcer. I may give you a Tootsie Roll if you answer it correctly. Your parents might buy you, a new set of tires. I don't know, shoes. One of the girls in my class got new shoes if she did well in school. A negative reinforcer releases from an unpleasant situation. So if I said, if you get a 95 on your third exam, you don't have to take your fourth exam. That would be releasing you from a negative reinforcer, and it strengthens the behavior. A lot of times people think that when they're negatively reinforcing, it's more of a punishment, that they're doing something punishing. But both of them, remember, strengthens the behavior. So you can have a negative reinforcer, which is releasing from an unpleasant situation, but it will still strengthen the behavior. For example, I have a young man when I used to be a behavior specialist, and he would always get kicked out of class every day, and his teacher would send him down to my office, and I'd have to babysit him pretty much for an hour. And she thought, though, that, and it didn't stop. Every day he got kicked out of class. And so I went to her, and I'm like, Carol, listen, you're negatively reinforcing this behavior. And she's like, it doesn't matter. He has a consequence for his behavior. I'm like, I know, but it's not reducing the behavior. It's actually strengthening the behavior. He's acting out more because he would rather being released from an unpleasant situation. He didn't like being in class, so he'd rather be released from that unpleasant situation so that it strengthens that behavior. So that behavior is going to increase. Now, if she really wanted him to stop misbehaving, having him sit in class would have probably been a punisher. So it would have decreased the behavior. So consequences. whether reinforcement have to do with consequences. And that's perhaps the most important principle of behavior learning theories, is that behavior changes according to its immediate consequences. Typically, we call this ABC, antecedent, behavior, and consequences. So we're looking at what's happening just before the behavior occurs, and then we're looking at the consequence, whether it be positive, negative, or a punisher, after the behavior. In other words, pleasurable consequences increase the frequency in which an individual engages in a behavior, whereas unpleasant consequences tends to reduce the frequency of a behavior. So let's look at some of those reinforcers. A reinforcer is defined as any consequence that strengthens, that is, increases the frequency of a behavior. The effectiveness of a reinforcer must be demonstrated. We cannot assume that a particular consequence is a reinforcer until we have evidence that either strengthens a particular behavior for that individual. And sometimes we're going to reinforce positive behaviors, and that way it's going to strengthen them doing something positive. No reward can be assumed to be a reinforcer for everyone under all conditions. So, one of the things you want to ask yourself is the behavior changing? If it's not changing, then it's not working. That's one of the things you always have to think about. Another thing you have to think about is what kind of rewards you're going to actually give. Intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. Often the most important reinforcer maintains a behavior that is pleasurably inherent. It's inherent pleasure to engage in that behavior. Sometimes people will run. I find absolutely no reward in running, but some of you might find it. My husband does. So they're intrinsically motivated to run. I actually like to bike. So I'll get on my bike and I start to bike ride, and I'll, just keep pedaling, and I keep pedaling, and like 15 miles later, 18 miles later, I'm starting to get tired. And then I'm like, okay, I don't bike ride just because it's not unpleasant. I do it because it is a pleasurable experience for me. And that's intrinsic. I get intrinsic motivation from that. Extrinsic reinforcers are those things like praise or rewards, like candy or stars or grades, and are given to motivate people who engage in a behavior that they might not do without it. So your parents may be paying you for grades, or you get some kind of a sticker or reward. Those are things that are called extrinsic reinforcers. Now, let me make something clear too. We don't always know what reinforcers are. For example, Dr. Hines had a client at one time, a student that she worked with, that all he wanted for his reward was to brush his teeth after lunch. He would do almost all of his schoolwork, his classwork in the morning, as long as he got to brush his teeth after lunch. I would normally think that allowing a child to brush his teeth would be an extrinsic motivator. However, I had a child at one time too, wouldn't do any work. I tried everything. I tried, homework passes. I even tried punishers. I tried everything. I tried ice cream parties. I tried, you name it, stickers, mystery motivators, everything I could think of. And finally one day I just looked at him and said, Corey, I want you to do your work, okay? I want you to get through the class. I want you to do your work. Just tell me, what is it that you would want? What kind of reward would you want? And he said, weeding the garden with Mr. Mendoza. Now, we live in Florida. It is god-awful hot out there. And that boy wanted to go out there and pick weeds. That was what he wanted as his reward, was to be able to go pick weeds with a gardener, the maintenance man that we had at our school. I wouldn't have picked that in a million gazillion years. So one of the things you always want to think about is making sure, you might think something is like the best thing ever, and the kid has no motivation whatsoever. It is not an extrinsic reward for him at all, or her at all. So one of the things you want to think about and work with is exactly what does motivate that child. So when we look at this classroom use, we have to describe what behaviors you want from students, and then reinforce those behaviors when they occur. So when kids are raising their hands, you want to give them praise. You want to say, gosh, I like the way my class is raising their hands. I like the way Susan is sitting up tall. I like the way Brian asked for permission. I like the way, Monique asked for da-da-da-da. You tell the kids exactly what behaviors you want, and when they exhibit that desired behavior, you reinforce it, and then you tell them why. I really like that Brian is sitting up in his seat. That allows us to, move along in our lesson. It shows me that he's listening. And you want to reinforce that appropriate behavior as soon as you see it occur. Punishers. Now, I'm going to tell you, punishers work. I'll also tell you why you shouldn't use them. Consequences that are weak in behavior call a punisher. Note that they are in the same catch in the definition of punishment as there is in reinforcement. If an apparently unpleasant consequence does not reduce the frequency of the behavior it follows, it is not necessarily a punisher. So one of the things that we want to look at when we're talking about punishers is punishers decrease the frequency of behavior. That's what they do. But what happens is if the punisher, the person who is giving the punishment, leaves, then the likelihood the behavior is going to come back is pretty high. If every time you walked into your bedroom you got an electric shock, the likelihood, if it was a pretty good jolt, the likelihood that you would walk through that door of your bedroom is pretty slim. But if you watched other people walking through the door and not getting a jolt, you would start to do it again. And that's exactly the problem with punishers. It doesn't replace the negative behavior that has been exhibited with a positive behavior. It just punishes the behavior. Another thing that they talk about is immediacy of consequences. Much like a dog, if you've heard about this with dogs, like if you find them, like crap on the floor, that they peed on the floor or something like that, you're not supposed to yell at them unless you catch them in the act. Because a very important principle of behavioral learning theories is that consequences that follow behavior closely in time affect behavior far more than delayed consequences. Waiting to give the rat in the Skinner box its food pellet for pressing the bar will significantly increase learning time for the connection between the bar press and the food. By the time the food arrives, the rat may be doing something other than pressing the bar. So they have to almost be a one-on-one correspondence. We have to do it right away so that they know this is the reason why I'm getting a treat. And when they talk about this, if you look at it, remember I said about ABA, the antecedent behavior and consequence? When we're looking at figure 5.2 of reducing disruptive behavior with sit and watch, you can see that the number of disruptive behaviors per 10-minute sessions. In the beginning, there's a lot, right, that baseline. And then after the sit and watch takes place, in the alternative education class, you can see that it pretty much goes down to 0 or like less than 5 that it goes down to, or maybe 5, maybe 10. And then it has number of disruptive behaviors per 10-minute session. And you can see that the same thing kind of happens, but then in a 4th grade class. So one of the things that you want to look at when you're doing ABA model is that you collect baseline data, you do your behavior where you're either reinforcing or punishing the behavior, and then next you go back to collect that data to see whether or not it was really that reinforcer that worked. Another aspect of behaviorism is shaping. Shaping through timely feedback on each step of the task is an effective way of teaching practice based on behavioral learning theory. When you guide students towards a goal, you are reinforcing the steps that lead you to success, and that's what we call shaping. Shaping is like one step at a time, and you reinforce them and you give the child feedback about what they're doing, and then they learn through trial and error that step, and then yes, I'm doing well, and the feedback that they get, that they're finally going to get to that new behavior. They do this a lot with people who are like afraid of things too. They'll positively reinforce them and have them like sit in a seat. Let's say you're afraid to fly and they have you go to the airport first, and then they positively reinforce that. The next time they may have you sit near in one of those little pretend seats in the front, and then they slowly but surely will shape you so that you're no longer afraid. Extinction is the weakening and gradual disappearance of a behavior as reinforcement is withdrawn. You can't constantly be reinforcing behaviors over and over and over again forever. So you have to do something called extinction. And what Pavlov actually, or Skinner actually suggested when they talked about this is that you start to do a schedule of reinforcement, which is a variable schedule of reinforcement. So you're not reinforcing every time, and then you're taking it longer and longer, and then slowly but surely you're completely withdrawing it. So that brings us back to that whole idea of schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement are used to increase desired behavior probability, frequency, or persistence of a desired behavior. So there's different ways that you can do this. You can do it with fixed or variable ratios, and fixed or variable intervals. Now, if you go back over here and you look at the difference, ratio means number. So it's 1 to 1, 3 to 1, 3 to 2, we'll say. Intervals mean time. So it might be every 5 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 6 minutes. But a ratio would be like every time a child calls out, they get, number one, a Tootsie Roll. Every time they raise their hand, not call out, they do a good behavior. Every time they raise their hand, they'll get a Tootsie Roll. And it might be every single time. That's a one-on-one correspondence. Then it could be that every 3 times that they raise their hand or use an appropriate avenue of getting someone's attention, that they get just one reprimand or one poke that goes along with it. But if you're reinforcing it, it would be like every 3 times that they raise their hand, they would get a Tootsie Roll. If it would be time, it would be every 3 minutes. I'm going to check to see if they're on task, and if they're on task, then they get a Tootsie Roll every 3 minutes. So if we look at this, a fixed ratio is a constant number, notice it says number, of behavior for required reinforcement. And it's a steady response rate, pause after reinforcement. And there's a rapid drop in response rate after required number of responses passes without reinforcement. So if you have a fixed ratio and the child hasn't got it into their repertoire yet, if it's too long between the next reinforcement, then the child's just going to let it go. However, if per se it happens at a regular interval, that, like you're doing it every 3 times, every 3 to 1, 3 to 1, 3 to 1, and the kids caught on to that and they really get it, they're going to expect it at every 3. But then you're going to have to tell them that you're going now to maybe a variable ratio, where it might not be every 3 times, it might be every 6 times, it could be every 9 times. That goes along with it. So a variable ratio, it varies the number of behaviors required for reinforcement. And it's a steady high response rate. And response rates are high and then they drop off. At a fixed interval, it's a constant amount of time passes before the reinforcement is available. Uneven rate with rapid acceleration at the end of each interval. And then during extinction, there's a rapid drop in response rate after initial time passes with no reinforcement. The variable interval, the variable amount of time passes before a variable. So it varies. It could be 1 minute, and then it could be 6 minutes, and then it could be 12 minutes, and then it could be 1 minute, and then it could be 15 minutes. So it's a variable amount, and it's a steady high response rate. Slot machines work on a variable interval ratio. Not necessarily, it could be on a variable ratio, a variable interval. It could go days, though. And it's a slow decrease in rate of response when you're using extinction. And when it's during it, it's steady high rate of response. Now, one of the things that we have to worry about when we get to extinction is the principle of extinction holds that when reinforcement of a previously learned behavior is withdrawn, the behavior will fade away. Does this mean that teachers must reinforce students' behaviors forever? If you gradually increase the number of math problems a student must do to be praised, and praise the student at random intervals, like a variable ratio, then the student will likely continue to do math problems for a long time with little or no reinforcement to you. So you just have to know that every once in a while they're going to get, a reinforcement. Now, antecedent. Remember I told you it was ABC, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Antecedent stimuli serves as cueing to indicating which behaviors will be reinforced or punished. So, for instance, I had a little boy that would throw a fit and fall into a fetal position every day. And we had to figure out what was the antecedent, what was happening just before that behavior. And so one of the things that we realized it was when the teacher said, take out your math books. It didn't matter what time of day it was. That kid went into a complete meltdown phase when you said that. So we have to teach that to the child, and we have to also teach discrimination, which involves using cues to detect differences between stimuli situations. So one of the things we had to tell him was, what could he do? Because he would get really anxious when he heard that about math. And then he would, we had to teach him not to disrobe, and we had to teach him that he had to stay, that he could work through this. We had to say, like, okay, instead of saying, take out your math book, I would walk over to him and I would say, all right, John, we're going to be transitioning to math real soon. And don't worry about it. Remember, we've got this deal that as soon as I explain it to everybody else, that I'm going to come over here and help you. So that it gave him that comfort to know that it wasn't going to be a complete freak out for him. Which leads us a lot of idea to generalization. Humans in particular, all animals, but humans in particular also have a problem with generalization, which involves responding to similarities between differences or between stimuli, and then transfer that to new behaviors or new learned set of behaviors. An example I always like to give is I taught kids how to use a scanner a long time ago, and they wrote up on my evaluations because there was a different type of scanner in the library, and they couldn't transfer the knowledge I had given them on how to use our scanner up in our building to use a different scanner. And I know it doesn't sound like it's possible because you guys are all like, okay, it's all the same. But it was a big deal for them. And Gardner, the guy that did the multiple intelligences, did a bunch of experiments on this about generalization because it was part of the G factor of intelligence factor. And one of the things he found was, it was this computer game where you did these certain keystrokes, and you were able to lasso butterflies. And you could, I think the most you could get was like 18, where you could catch all the butterflies. Well, he went and then they went and switched it, and they did it to horses. But it was exactly the same, lassoing horses instead of catching butterflies. It was like putting a little noose around some horses. But it was exactly the same keystrokes. But the people that would, just as though they had just got done working on the butterfly game, they would switch over to the horse game. And it was interesting because you would think they would just do the same strokes, and they would have been able to get as many as they did the time before. But their learning would drop all the way back down to 0, and they would have to rebuild, just like they did for the butterflies, because they couldn't generalize the skills. Some people did, but very few could generalize their skills from one scenario to another. So we also have to look at social learning theory that contributed to our understanding of human learning. And social learning theory is that we learn from each other. And a major outgrowth of this behavioral learning theory tradition was Watson saying that you could change the kid's environment. But so we started Meschenbaum and Bandura. They started looking at observational and self-regulated learning. And that was the idea that we learn through doing with others. Going back to Vygotsky and that idea that we, it's cooperative learning. We have to construct learning with someone else. So Bandura's model of observational learning, that Bandura noted that learning through modeling directly or vicariously involved 4 stages: paying attention, returning the modeled behavior, reproducing the behavior, and then being motivated to repeat the behavior. And Bandura proposed that students should be taught to have expectations for their own performances and reinforcement for themselves. So you shouldn't always be giving the reinforcement, that the kid starts to reinforce him or herself. And he says that through that learning model, you go through those 4 stages, which is why when we get to chapter 7, we start talking about developing lesson plans, we talk about the idea of when you write, it's I do, we do, you do. So that the child sees you doing it, then you do it together, and then they do it on their own. And so that's pretty much what they're talking about here. And I do, they would be paying attention. And we do, they would be kind of practicing or retaining that model behavior and then reproducing that behavior by themselves. So Bandura proposed that students should be taught to have expectations and be able to do it on their own and evaluate their own. Bandura has 4 phases of observational learning. The attentional phase, the first phase is observational learning, is paying attention to the model. In general, students pay attention to role models. If they're attractive, successful, interesting, or popular, they pay attention to them more. Then it goes to the retention phase. Once teachers have their students' attention, it is time to model the behavior they want their students to imitate, and then give students a chance to practice or rehearse it. And then they talks about the reproduction stage. During the reproduction phase, students try to match their behavior to the models. If you've ever been around little kids and you watch them model what you're doing, in the classrooms, the assessment of student learning takes place during this phase. When they're reproducing. Usually that's when they start to do the we do, when you're walking around and you're watching them kind of imitate what you're doing. And then we have the motivational stage. And the final stage in the observational learning process is motivation. Students will imitate a model because they believe that doing so will increase their chances of it being reinforced, that they'll get praise from the teacher. So Bandura talks about this with parents and with teachers, that kids will model what you do. They'll pay attention to what you do. Then they start to practice what you do. They'll practice and rehearse it. Then they'll do it on their own, and they'll try to kind of do it while you're watching, and then they'll see whether or not you praise them. Meschenbaum did a lot of with Bandura's idea of observational learning, but he also put in there the idea of self-regulated learning, and that students can be taught to monitor and regulate their own behavior. Self-regulated learning strategies of this kind are often called cognitive behavior modification. And matter of fact, most of behaviorism has gone into this idea of cognitive behaviorism or cognitive behavior modification. And what they're really trying to do is he developed strategies that said to the kids, train themselves, like, what's my problem? What's my plan? Am I using my plan? And how did I do? So that even though you're reinforcing your behavior and such like that, that you go along with Bandura's ideas, but he kind of made it more like a metacognitive thing where the kid is actually reinforcing himself instead of waiting for someone else to reinforce them. The strengths and limitations of behavioral learning theories, however, are central to the application at EdPsych, because one of the things that we use it a lot in classroom management. We use it a lot in discipline, in motivation, and instructional models. It went crazy for a little while, probably in the 1970s and early 80s, where we were using it too much. I worked in a center where a little beeper would go off every 3 minutes, and then you would have to reward the child if they were on task or off task. And it was all about the environment. It was nothing about the child's own choices. So I had a young man that was in a study that I did, and he shot the pizza delivery man, and I said to him, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, I told him if he didn't give me the pizza, I was going to have to shoot him." And he goes, "What else could I do? I had to shoot him." I'm like, "No, you could have walked away." But he goes, "No, Miss P, there's always a consequence to the behavior." And I told him what the consequence was going to be, so I had to follow through. And that was a lot of the schools in the 80s that were like that it didn't matter the real reasoning behind what the kid did, that you just had to follow through with whatever the consequence was for that behavior, regardless of what the motivation behind why the kid was doing it. So we were teaching them not to pay attention to the why, just to the behavior of what. So a lot of people moved away from that because it tended to have more aggressive children, and then they went into the whole idea of cognitive. And matter of fact, if you look at behaviorists now, people who consider themselves behaviorists, they look at positive, it's called functional behavior assessments, and they look at what is the function of the behavior. Are they trying to escape something? Are they trying to get a reward? What is that function of what they're doing? And then they relate that back to the different types of reinforcers that go with it. But they're going for the why that has to do with it. And that's end of chapter 5.